On August 12, 1943, radar operators along the Sardinian coast picked up a strange contact. At first, they assumed it was another Allied bomber crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa, one of the hundreds that now ruled the skies over Italy. But then ground observers reported something unusual. The plane had twin booms, a twin tail, and a central cockpit pod, a design none of them had ever seen before. It was a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, one of America's most advanced fighters. That morning, U.S. Army Air Force pilots from the 82nd Fighter Group had been escorting B-17 bombers returning from a raid on Naples. Over Sardinia, one Lightning, flown by Second Lieutenant Kenneth Sparks, was hit by flak and lost power in one engine. With his aircraft bleeding oil and altitude, Sparks managed to glide down to a rough landing on a beach near Capoterra. He destroyed his maps and sidearm, but couldn't ignite the aircraft before local soldiers arrived. Within hours, the Italian Air Force had its hands on the first intact P-38 Lightning ever captured in Europe. The aircraft, serial number 42-13101, was crated and shipped north to the Regia Aeronautica's experimental test centre at Guidonia, near Rome, the same base where Italian designers had once tested the sleek Macchi and Reggiane fighters of the pre-war years. The engineers there, led by Colonel Sergio Stefanini and engineer Ezio Bernardi, were veterans of aircraft development. They had worked on Italy's own radial and inline engines, the Fiat A74, and the powerful but unreliable DB601 derivatives built under German license. When the American fighter arrived, still bearing US markings, they were stunned by what they saw. The P-38 looked alien, all smooth aluminum, no fabric surfaces, no exposed rivets, twin engines, retractable landing gear, and a bubble canopy giving full visibility. Its twin Allison V1710 F-17 engines each produced 1,600 horsepower, driving counter-rotating propellers to cancel torque. Its design allowed it to reach over 660 kilometers per hour, 410 miles per hour, faster than any Italian fighter in service. To the Italians, it looked like something from the future. They began to disassemble it carefully under the supervision of the Ufficio Tecnico, the technical office. What they found inside left them speechless. The electrical wiring was color-coded and bundled with plastic insulation, a technique unheard of in Italian production, where wires were still manually wrapped in cloth and varnish. The hydraulic lines were stainless steel and marked with serial codes. The turbo-supercharger assembly, located behind the engines, was controlled by automatic wastegates linked to cockpit instruments that managed pressure in real time. Engineer Bernardi wrote in his notes, "This airplane seems to think for the pilot." The twin engines could maintain power at 8,000 meters thanks to their turbo-superchargers, giving the Lightning speed and climb that no Italian or German fighter could match. Italy's best aircraft, the Macchi C-202 Folgore and Reggiane Re 2005 Sagittario, were excellent designs on paper, but underpowered and difficult to mass produce. The Americans, by contrast, had standardized everything. When the Italian technicians examined the Allison engine's cylinders, they were astonished by the tight machining tolerances. The piston heads fit perfectly. The bearings were polished to mirror finish, and every part bore stamped serial numbers for traceability. At a time when Italian factories struggled with uneven alloys and manual fitting, this level of precision looked like magic. They measured, sketched, and documented everything, even the ammunition feeds and cockpit layout. The P-38's gun sight was gyroscopically stabilized, something Italian designers had never seen. By the time they finished the preliminary inspection, Colonel Stefanini gathered his officers and said quietly, "Gentlemen, this is a flying machine we cannot reproduce, not in a year, not in 10. For the first time, Italy's aviation experts confronted a truth their pilots had already suspected over the skies of Sicily and Tunisia. They were fighting a technological war they could no longer win. The report from Guidonia was stamped Riservatissimo, top secret, and circulated only to senior Regia Aeronautica officers and to the German liaison staff in Rome. It described the P-38 as a masterpiece of industrial engineering and warned that the Allied air forces were producing these in thousands. When the Germans read it, even they were impressed. By that point, Luftwaffe officers had also captured a P-38 in France and reached the same conclusion. The Lightning was not just an aircraft, it was an industrial statement. And as Italy's cities burned under Allied bombers, the contrast could not have been more painful. At Guidonia Monticello, just east of Rome, the Regia Aeronautica's Centro Sperimentale di Volo, the experimental flight center, had once been the pride of Italian aviation. Before the war, it had tested sleek racing seaplanes, advanced prototypes, and the bold dreams of a country that had once led in aeronautical innovation. But by 1943, those dreams were dying under the weight of Allied bombing raids, material shortages, and fuel starvation. When the captured Lockheed P-38 Lightning arrived, the base came alive again, if only for curiosity. It was a gleaming silver twin-engine machine unlike anything Italy had built. The technicians unloaded it carefully, hauling it into the hangar once used for testing Italy's fastest pre-war aircraft. For the engineers who had spent years patching together old designs, it was like opening a portal to another era. Colonel Sergio Stefanini, chief of the technical division, ordered that the P-38 be fully examined but not damaged. "This aircraft must be treated as a teacher," he said. "We will learn from it." The dismantling began systematically. The wings were separated, the engines removed and mounted on stands, and the cockpit stripped of every instrument for cataloguing. Italian and German officers observed from a balcony while draftsmen sketched every detail. The first discovery that shocked the engineers was the finish of the metalwork. The Lightning's aluminum panels were perfectly flush riveted, polished and anodized for corrosion resistance. Each seam was aligned with mathematical precision. Italian fighters, by comparison, often showed uneven rivet spacing and overlapping plates. "Even the skin tells a story," one engineer murmured. "Ours look built by craftsmen. Theirs, by machines." Then came the engines, the Allison V1710F-17S. Each was a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled power plant with a turbo-supercharger system that allowed it to maintain full performance at high altitude. Italian mechanics had never seen such a complex integration of engine, exhaust manifold, and supercharger. The turbos were mounted behind the engines in the tail booms, connected by long ducting pipes, a layout that looked inefficient on paper but worked flawlessly in practice. When the Italians tested the right engine on a stand, the entire hangar shook. The Allison roared to life, steady and smooth, delivering its full 1,600 horsepower without sputter or vibration. The technicians watched as the automatic boost controller adjusted pressure perfectly. One mechanic turned to his colleague and said, "It breathes by itself." They were astonished by the metallurgy of the turbine blades, made of alloys resistant to heat far beyond anything available in Italy. The country's metallurgical industry, crippled by lack of nickel and chromium, simply could not produce material of that quality. Even Germany struggled with the same limitation. Engineer Ezio Bernardi, who led the technical analysis, compared the turbo-supercharger design to the Fiat and Piaggio systems then in service. His conclusion was devastating. "Ours depend on luck and careful hands. Theirs depend on mathematics and precision." The cockpit inspection produced similar revelations. Every gauge and lever was clearly labelled in English, lit by tiny lamps for night flight. The throttle quadrant was smooth and responsive. The radio set included multiple channels and an automatic tuning system, far beyond the crude, short-range sets in Italian fighters. The oxygen system was self-regulating. Even the gun sight featured a gyroscopic compensator that automatically predicted a target's movement. Bernardi wrote in his notes, "This airplane is not built around a man's instinct. It is built around his mind." When the engineers calculated the Lightning's performance envelope, they were stunned. With its twin engines, the P-38 could climb to 40,000 feet, fly over 400 miles per hour, and operate over 1,000 kilometers from base, all while carrying a heavy armament of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose. At that time, the Machi C-202 Folgore, Italy's best frontline fighter, reached barely 370 miles per hour and struggled above 30,000 feet. The newer C-205 Veltro, still entering production, could match the Lightning only at low altitude, and there were fewer than 200 of them available. As the Italians compared performance charts, a grim realization spread through the room. The Americans were mass-producing an aircraft that matched or exceeded Italy's best prototypes, and they were doing it by the thousand. Colonel Stefanini gathered his officers. "We cannot build this," he said quietly. "We do not have the machines, we do not have the metals, and we no longer have the time." The P-38 report from Guidonia circulated through the Regia Aeronautica in the following days. A summarized version was even sent to Berlin for evaluation by Messerschmitt engineers who had already captured a similar aircraft in France. Their verdict matched the Italians. The Lightning's turbo-supercharger and production precision placed it a full generation ahead of Axis technology. What impressed the Germans most was not raw performance but reliability. The American engine could fly hundreds of hours without overhaul, while German and Italian engines required constant maintenance. For Italy's engineers, the captured P-38 was more than an airplane. It was a revelation. It showed that the Allies were fighting an industrial war, not a romantic one. They had turned factories into arsenals of precision. When the final report was signed, Colonel Stefanini added a private note in his logbook. "This aircraft represents what we once hoped to be. We are builders of the past, not of the future." By the time the Lightning was reassembled for a limited test flight, Italy itself was falling apart. The fascist regime had collapsed in July, Mussolini had been arrested, and German troops were flooding into the peninsula. But for one brief moment in that hangar at Guidonia, surrounded by the shining alloy and intricate machinery of an American fighter, Italy's finest engineers saw their future, and it looked like defeat. By late August 1943, the captured Lockheed P-38 Lightning at Guidonia was ready for flight testing. Italian mechanics had spent weeks reassembling the twin-boom fighter, carefully following their sketches and photographs. They'd restored the hydraulic systems, replaced a damaged propeller blade, and cleaned the spark plugs and filters. Despite all odds and limited fuel, the aircraft stood gleaming under the Roman sun, its olive-drab paint still bearing the white star of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The Regia Aeronautica's test pilot, Maggiore Angelo Tondi, was chosen for the flight. Tondi was one of Italy's most skilled evaluation pilots, having tested the Machi C-205 Veltro and the Reggiane Re 2005. He spoke fluent English and had studied Allied aircraft captured in North Africa. Still, when he climbed into the P-38's cockpit, he hesitated. Everything felt different. The throttle layout, the dual control systems, the battery of gauges surrounding him like the dashboard of an advanced car. He flicked through the laminated checklists the Americans had left in a side pocket. Each procedure was printed step by step, color-coded and standardized. An approach unheard of in Italy, where most pilots relied on memory. "They build for the ordinary man," Tondi murmured. "We build for the ace." The Allison V1710 engine started with a deep, smooth hum. No coughing, no smoke. The propellers spun in opposite directions, eliminating torque roll, something every Italian fighter pilot struggled with on takeoff. Mechanics cleared the runway as the twin Lightning roared forward, its tricycle landing gear absorbing the bumps effortlessly. The aircraft lifted off after a short run, climbing steadily into the pale Roman sky. At first, Tondi kept the throttle low, circling over Guidonia to check controls. The Lightning handled unlike anything he'd flown before, heavy but perfectly balanced. Its twin engines delivered power without vibration, and the automatic turbo regulation kept manifold pressure constant as he climbed. When he leveled out at 8,000 meters, the airspeed indicator hovered near 650 kilometers per hour, 400 miles per hour. He radioed the tower. "Incredible stability. No torque. I feel I could let go of the stick." Observers on the ground recorded the aircraft's performance with binoculars and stopwatches. The P-38 climbed faster and flew smoother than any Italian or German twin-engine fighter they'd ever tested. Its cooling system kept temperatures steady. The supercharger whined faintly as it maintained pressure. When Tondi banked into a steep turn, the aircraft responded immediately. Firm, predictable, precise. After 20 minutes, he switched to combat simulation. Dive, roll, climb. The Lightning handled each maneuver with a grace that stunned him. At 400 miles per hour, the controls stiffened but never locked, a testament to its hydraulic assistance and aerodynamic design. The Italian technicians watching from the ground exchanged uneasy glances. When Tondi landed, the twin tails shimmered in the afternoon heat. He shut down the engines and climbed out, pulling off his leather helmet. "It flies like an eagle," he said simply. "It feels unbreakable." That night, his flight report confirmed what the engineers had already learned from disassembly. Stability, unmatched for a twin-engine aircraft. Visibility, superior thanks to the bubble canopy. Engine reliability, exceptional even with low-grade fuel. Performance, 60–80 km/h faster than the best Italian fighters. In a private note, Tondi added, "This machine is not an aircraft. It is a weapon system. Every control, every dial is designed to make the pilot efficient, not heroic. We cannot build this." When word reached the Luftwaffe attaché in Rome, the Germans requested to witness the next test. 2 weeks later, a team from the Rechlin Experimental Center arrived. They were equally astonished. One German officer, Major Hans Petersen, compared it directly with the Messerschmitt Bf110 and Me210. "Yours is a craftsman's airplane," he told the Italians. "Theirs is an engineer's." The Germans were particularly interested in the turbo-supercharger system. After observing, they admitted their own designs lagged far behind. Even the advanced Focke-Wulf Tar 154 and Me 410 lacked the P-38's altitude performance. The following week, the captured Lightning was flown again, this time for demonstration. It easily outclimbed a Machi C-205 Escort and left it far behind on the straight. When the pilots landed, the comparison was undeniable. The Lightning represented not just superior design, but industrial might. Then, history overtook the experiment. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced its armistice with the Allies. Chaos erupted across the country. German forces occupied Rome, seizing all strategic facilities, including Guidonia Air Base. The Italian engineers barely had time to hide their notes before the Germans arrived. When the Wehrmacht entered the hangar, they found the P-38 still parked on the tarmac. Within days, it was loaded onto a train and shipped north for further study at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's testing center in Germany. Colonel Stefanini watched it go, standing beside Bernardi and Tondi. "So they will learn from it now," he said bitterly. Bernardi replied, "We already have." That's the tragedy. Guidonia fell silent after that. Many of its engineers scattered or went into hiding. Italy itself was now split, the north under German occupation, the south under Allied control. The P-38 never returned. But the memory of its flight remained, carried in notebooks, sketches, and the haunted respect of those who had seen what it could do. For the Italians who had studied it, the message was clear. The war was already lost. Not because of bravery, but because of industry. The factories, machines, and precision that could create a fighter like the P-38 in thousands, while Italy struggled to produce a few dozen at a time. As one engineer later wrote after the war, "We realized then that the sky no longer belonged to us. It belonged to whoever could build faster, stronger, and smarter." When German troops entered Guidonia Air Base in mid-September 1943, the war in Italy was already dissolving into chaos. The captured Lockheed P-38 Lightning, carefully restored and studied by Italian engineers for weeks, now became another prize for the Reich. German transport crews surrounded the aircraft within hours. They crated its wings, engines, and instruments, marked the boxes with Nach Rechlin, and shipped it north to the Luftwaffe's main test center in Germany. For the Italian staff who had worked on it, the removal was a quiet humiliation. Colonel Sergio Stefanini and engineer Ezio Bernardi watched in silence as the American fighter was loaded onto trucks. Around them, the once proud Centro Sperimentale di Volo lay half abandoned. Allied bombers had cratered nearby runways, fuel stores were empty, and half the personnel had fled south to join the newly formed co-belligerent air force. The remainder stayed behind under German supervision, their research notebooks suddenly far more valuable than their loyalty. The Germans brought the P-38 to Rechlin, where Luftwaffe engineers had already been testing a Lightning captured months earlier in France. The Italians' technical notes confirmed what German specialists had found. The Allison V-1710 with turbo-supercharger technology gave the Lightning altitude performance no Axis engine could match. Its systems were reliable, modular, and standardized, every detail traceable by part number. Rechlin engineers issued a final report to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium in late 1943. It praised the P-38's excellent craftsmanship and extraordinary engine installation, and concluded bluntly, "The United States has achieved mass production with precision equal to or greater than our best prototypes." Even as the report circulated, Allied air raids were destroying the factories that produced Germany's best engines. There would be no response to the P-38's challenge. In liberated southern Italy, some of Guidonia's former engineers rejoined the Allies. Others disappeared into civilian work or were drafted into German-controlled factories in the north. Colonel Stefanini was arrested briefly by the Wehrmacht, then released when he agreed to cooperate with the new Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana. He never worked on another aircraft after 1945. Maggiore Angelo Tondi, the test pilot who had flown the captured Lightning, later served as an instructor for the co-belligerent air arm. In interviews after the war, he remembered that day above Rome vividly. "When I felt its engines pull, I understood the war in the air was over. We were brave, yes, but bravery does not outfly mathematics." Engineer Bernardi joined the post-war Fiat Aviazione Design Bureau, helping rebuild Italy's aviation industry under Allied supervision. In 1947, he wrote a short internal paper titled The Guidonia Lesson. In it, he described the P-38 examination not as defeat, but as revelation. It showed us what discipline of industry means, how the Americans had turned every bolt and valve into a soldier. We learned that invention without production is vanity. The Lightning sent to Rechlin was flight tested by the Luftwaffe's Versuchsverband OB.DL, Experimental Evaluation Unit. German pilots admired its range and climb rate, using it occasionally to train against Allied interception tactics. But fuel shortages and constant bombing grounded it by mid-1944. It was destroyed during an Allied air raid on the Rechlin airfield that August, a fitting end for the machine that had symbolized Allied superiority. Fragments of the aircraft were later recovered by Soviet troops in 1945. The serial plate was reportedly taken to Moscow for metallurgical analysis. No trace of the airframe survives today. For Italy's aviation community, the captured P-38 became a ghostly benchmark. During the 1950s, when Italy entered NATO and American fighters filled its new air bases, several former Guidonia engineers saw rows of gleaming F-84s and F-86 lined up under the same Roman sky. Bernardi is said to have turned to a colleague and whispered, "It took us 12 years to catch up to what we saw in that hangar." The surviving Guidonia documents, recovered from Allied archives in 1946, now rest in the Italian Air Force Historical Museum at Vigna di Valle. Their pages include hand-drawn schematics of the Lightning's turbo-supercharger, cross-sections of its Allison pistons, and performance notes written in pencil under the heading Impossibile riprodurre. Impossible to reproduce. Historians consider those notes one of the most candid technical admissions of the Axis era. They show that long before Italy's surrender, its engineers understood the real balance of power in the air. The Allies' advantage lay not just in bravery or numbers, but in precision, the invisible empire of tolerances, alloys, and assembly lines. When the war ended, Guidonia's hangars were stripped bare, but the story of the captured P-38 lived on in whispered memory. To the men who had studied it, the Lightning was more than an enemy aircraft. It was the moment Italy looked into the mirror of modern war and saw its own limits. Colonel Stefanini died in 1949. His wartime diary, found among family papers, ended with a single line written in fading ink. "We opened its heart to understand it, and found there the reason we could not win." The captured P-38 that once shimmered over Rome never flew again, but in the quiet of Guidonia's ruins, it left behind a final lesson. Not every defeat is written in blood. Some are etched in aluminum,